The title of my lecture tonight is Rereading the Bengali Poet Qazi Nazrul Islam. Qazi Nazrul Islam is one of the greatest revolutionary poets in the world and one of the greatest Bengali poets. And I want to say a few words about the drift of my lecture, actually. My purpose here is not to offer a comprehensive critical evaluation of the entire range of Qazi Nazrul Islam's works and activities, and I don't think that such an evaluation is possible here, but I intend to dwell on only a few aspects of Nazrul's works, particularly the ones that I think have remained by and large unexplored, while I also want to introduce the poet to those who are yet to know and explore him. I have an epigraph to my lecture, and this epigraph is taken from the late 19th century, early 19th century Bengali mystic Lauren Fakir, and in English translation it is this: whose kingdom is whose? In his voice we continue to hear the cadences, inflections and accents of resistance and liberation. And his syntax continues to morph into what the Irish anti-colonial writer James Joyce calls syntax, disturbing and disrupting the literary establishment, even the dominant order of things. And it is he, a poet, an activist, one organically rooted in the struggles of the world and the world, who could inspire the Cuban writer David Fernandez Sherikan to offer such lines as "Wanted, a world without monopolies, without police." And it is he who could, I quote, shout himself hoarse in Calcutta football matches and spend silent hours over the chessboard, as one of his contemporaries, another Bengali poet, Buddhadev Bose, tells us. And again I quote, he had once started a gramophone shop and even acted in a play and a film. He has been loved by every notable contemporary and numerous unnotables. He has been a living denial of everything that withers the heart. His name has been synonym for charm, as Buddhadev Bose further tells us. And it is he who rubs and his words and images and tropes and tenors such that they catch fire. And it is he who in his poem proclaims that he is Krishna's throat, that he drinks poison from the ocean of sufferings and pain, and that he is at once the Om of Ishan's horn and the sound of Israfil's war bugle. And it is he who yokes together the banal and the so-called sublime, the abstract and the concrete, and the general and the specific in the dialectical dance of his imagination. And it is he who in a poem characterizes himself as the rebel son of the Mother Earth. I am speaking here of none other than our Qazi Nazrul Islam, known as our rebel poet, undoubtedly a major voice in the history of Bengali literature. And that voice can also be meaningfully placed in the revolutionary tradition of what has come to be known as, to use the Palestinian writer Ghassan Kanafani's famous term, resistance literature in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Or that voice can be placed in the tradition of what the Salvadoran poet Roque Dalton calls militant poetics, the kind of poetics that derives its fire and force from the very liberation struggles of peasants and without, however, rigorously contextualizing the phenomenon of violence vis-a-vis decolonization, sent a message to Qazi Nazrul Islam soon after he had founded a bi-weekly called the Dhumketu, in English, the Comet, in India. And here is the poem by Rabindranath Tagore in English translation to Qazi Nazrul Islam. Come, ye comet, come, to build a bridge of fire across the dark. Hoist up on the castle top of evil days your flag of victory. Let omens be carved on the forehead of the night. Awaken, startle those that drowse. Born on May 24, 1899, in a village of Bardhaman in West Bengal, Qazi Nazrul Islam began his career by first publishing a story in the journal called Shaugat in 1919, a year in which another great Bengali poet, Jivanananda Das, who was born a few months earlier in 1899, also published his first piece of writing, a poem. The title of Nazrul's first story, or for that matter, his first published work, is Boundoler Atmakahini, in English translation, the autobiography of a vagabond. Indeed, a kind of nomadism, some have called it even bohemianism, to exoticize Nazrul, characterizes the style of Nazrul's living and writing. Nazrul was uprooted from his family very early on. He grew up in tremendous poverty while he almost restlessly moved from place to place, from work to work, talking, singing, lecturing, and always writing. Indeed, Nazrul Islam is our first and so far the only major writer to come from the rural poor. And having almost no formal education, Nazrul Islam taught himself. As a critic rightly notes, I quote, Nazrul's arrival was sudden, his victory instantaneous. The life he lived was not like an unruly storm, or perhaps the month of May in Bengal, the month of thunder, lightning and storm, unquote. Indeed, the tropes of movements, even restless nomadic movements, as well as the images of thunder and lightning and storm, all keep recurring in a number of Nazrul's works, while thus enabling him to enunciate a highly dynamic, even dramatic, confrontational, militant, anti-colonial position characterized by an urgency and immediacy of his voice that would, to use the South African poet A.N.C. Koamalo's words, hit the oppressor like bullets. As we would see, Nazrul takes poetry itself as a charged site of actions and interventions as an anti-colonial praxis. Even his early stories, with which Nazrul began his writing career, at least partly attest to that praxis, although his voice as a whole, or rather his voices in their totality, can by no means be characterized quickly and one-sidedly, simply given his phenomenal productivity and the diversity of his passions, practices, and styles. It is here that again I need to call attention to Buddhadev Boshu's own evaluation of Nazrul. There is no doubt that Buddhadev Bose exhibited a high voltage enthusiasm about Nazrul's poetry at a time when other established poets and critics remained silent about him. Yet Buddhadev Boshu, characteristically remaining high on Eurocentric modernist aestheticism, utterly failed to account for the richness and variety, as well as the anti-colonial character and content of Nazrul's literary productions and music. Indeed, Nazrul is not only a poet and a short story writer, but also a musician, lyricist, a song composer, novelist, playwright, filmmaker, editor, journalist, even a drummer and an actor. But Nazrul's productivity and the variety of his preoccupations spanned a relatively brief period of 24 years between the two world wars, from 1919 to 1942. And of those 24 years, Nazrul gave only 12 to poetry, and later increasingly moved onto the world of music, inaugurating, one might argue, an excitingly experimental chapter in the global history of music itself. Over a period of 12 years then, Nazrul published a total of 15 collections of poems that include Ognibina in 1922, Dolan Chapa in 1923, Bisher Bashi in 1924, Bhangar Gan in 1924, again Chayanot in 1925, Chittanama in 1925, Shammavadi in 1925, Puber Hawa in 1926, Shorbohara in 1926 again, Foni Manusha 1927, Shindu Hindol in 1927, Jinjir in 1928, Chakrabak in 1929, Shondha in 1929 again, and Prolay Shikha in 1930. The list itself is not only remarkable in terms of underlying Nazrul's output, but it also immediately reveals the exceptional rapidity with which Nazrul produced his works. Indeed, none of his contemporaries, that included a whole host of figures from, say, Azfar Hussain and Ghulam Mustafa and Krishna Dayal Bose through Jivananda Das himself and Sudhindranath Datta and Josimuddin to Buddhadev Bosu and Vishnudev and Arun Mitra could simply match up to Nazrul's productivity. Even Rabindranath Tagore, who was also writing with full force in the 1920s, could not produce as much as Nazrul did during that decade, a decade that quickly established Nazrul as nothing short of a phenomenon in Bengali poetry. It is also revealing that his own contemporary Jivananda Das, who was even slightly older than Nazrul, was initially influenced by none other than Nazrul himself. In fact, Jivananda, a highly powerful poet as he is, was simply groping or seeking to find his voice in the world of poetry at a time when Nazrul had already reached a remarkable height of poetic accomplishments, while also coming to influence even his seniors. But Nazrul's productivity did not interfere with the quality of his poetry, as well as with the variety of thematic and stylistic trajectories he pursued in his work. Take the year 1922 as an example. It was in that year when Nazrul published his famous poem Bidrohi, in English, The Rebel, a rhetorically and linguistically explosive poem, a politically charged anti-colonial poem that immediately established Nazrul Islam as the rebel poet in Bengali literature. And it was in the same year when Nazrul wrote a number of poems, at least 18 other poems, a list of which is conveniently provided by the Nazrul researcher Abdul Mannan Sayyid. Following that list, one may mention such poems as Agamoni, Kamal Pasha, Anwar Pasha, Dodul Dul, Bandana Gan, Pagol Pothik, Nishitala Pritam, Dohonmala, Badol Dine, Dil Dorodi, and Fatiha-i Doaz Daham, among others. What is remarkable about Nazrul's achievements in 1922 alone was that Nazrul hardly repeated himself in his work. Rather, he exemplified and celebrated the richness of his own variety. For instance, on the one hand, he gave us a poem like Bidrohi, or The Rebel, in 1922, a long poem with unprecedented rhythmic charge and velocity, accompanied by a chain of dynamic and even highly performative signifiers that enact an interplay between the lyrical and the dramatic. On the other hand, in the same year, Nazrul produced a poem like Dodul Dul, experimenting with the Arabic meter called Motakari and producing the effects of chant and incantation. What is remarkable, again, also in 1922, what is remarkable was that Nazrul wrote poems like Kamal Pasha and Anwar Pasha in response to certain contemporary events, making the Gramscian point, so to speak, that I quote from Gramsci, events are the real dialectics of history, unquote. Nazrul wrote a poem about the death of Hazrat Muhammad in the same year, while at the same time, in yet another poem, he devoted his lines to the Hindu goddess Durga. Further, he offered us a series of love poems, varying his mood from the euphoric to the melancholic, for instance. And the year in which all this was done was again 1922. In sum, throughout the 1920s, Qazi Nazrul Islam exemplified productivity, variety, richness, and unprecedented stylistic and metrical innovations, the details of which cannot be even remotely recounted in a single piece lecture like this one. Well, I have hitherto confined myself to only a few aspects of Nazrul's poetry, but now I would pursue certain vectors underlying the politics of Nazrul's language in his poetry. And I want to do this by way of rereading his most famous poem called Bidrohi, in English, The Rebel. The fact that, to quote, "The war is in words," to quote James Joyce, of course, that, again I quote, "to use a language is to take on a worldview," unquote, to deploy Antonio Gramsci's famous formulation, or that, to quote, "to speak a language is to take on a world, a culture," unquote, to use Frantz Fanon's words, are all well exemplified with remarkable political effects in the entire work of Qazi Nazrul Islam, particularly in his poem called Bidrohi, or The Rebel. It is true that Nazrul is customarily read as a poet of revolt, that his voice continues to contest and combat and challenge the forces of feudalism, colonialism, and communalism, meaning religious sectarianism and religious rivalries, and of course such macrostructures of production relations and power relations as capitalism, imperialism, racism, and patriarchy, as they remain profoundly interconnected. However, Nazrul criticism in Bangladesh has hitherto paid relatively little attention to how the language of Bidrohi itself turns out to be an arena of political and cultural contestations and even struggles, suggesting thereby that class struggles themselves may variously involve what we might call language struggles, although class is by no means a merely discursive or linguistic phenomenon. Taking certain cues from Karl Marx's formulation of the relations of production, relations that historically obtain and operate in human societies, one might also speak of the relations of language, obtaining and operating as they do within the horizon of signifying or discursive practices like literary works themselves. Such language relations may then encompass the relations of a literary work to his tradition or to his history or to his predecessors. In other words, the relations of language may also include tensions and transactions between one set of discursive practices and another, or between one literary work and another. Bidrohi, which I reckon as a revolutionary signifying intervention on behalf of the toiling masses in particular, points up its own relations of language by way of making, on a massive scale indeed, what one might call linguistic transgressions, and thus unsettling an entire set of poetic or stylistic norms. I cannot but submit that one hardly finds a work in Bengali literature that formally anticipate Nazrul's Bidrohi in particular, a poem that combines in unprecedented ways a variety of metrical forms, patterns, and lexical resources. True, in the poem Bidrohi, Nazrul seeks to confront and combat domination of all forms. True, Nazrul was even sent to prison for writing poetry that fiercely fights domination. And one can certainly place Nazrul in the company of such third world revolutionary poet activists as Nazim Hikmet from Turkey, Roque Dalton from El Salvador, Oterano Castillo from Guatemala, Faiz Ahmed Faiz from Pakistan, Mahmoud Dervish from Palestine, Kim Chi Ha from Korea, and Jose Maria Sison from the Philippines, who all had to go to jail or prison because of their activist poetry that continues to fight and threaten the powerful and the dominant. While Nazrul's poetry took him to prison, the language of his poetry ends up breaking that prison and even sets him free in a certain sense. Indeed, Nazrul's Bidrohi dramatizes and mobilizes his accumulated resistance to the prison house of language. Given this resistance, then, one can also place Nazrul in the tradition of such figures as Chandidas, Nanak, and Lalan Fakir, who all radically explore the power and limits of language while seeking to fashion a new one by way of valorizing the freedom of humanity. Also, in terms of linguistic rebellion, one might compare Nazrul to Michael Madhusudan Datta, who inaugurated a decisive rupture with the literary tradition preceding him. Yet Nazrul is strikingly different from Madhusudan, for unlike the latter, Nazrul's language struggle, by and large, remains firmly, even organically, tied to his own people, poor farmers and peasants, that is to say. Thus, one can easily take Nazrul as an example of Gramsci's organic intellectuals, who are different from traditional intellectuals. For organic intellectuals, unlike their traditional counterparts, keep challenging and fighting the powerful and the dominant through forging organic, active ties to, or even being part of, the oppressed themselves, through deeply internalizing, articulating, and advancing their aspirations, their cause, their struggle at all levels. As Nazrul maintains symptomatically in Bidrohi, I quote in translation, "I am the pain and sorrow of all homeless sufferers. I am the anguish of the insulted," unquote. And surely Nazrul's Bidrohi can be read as an exemplary anti-colonial text, the kind of text that is animated and energized by opposition and resistance to colonialism. One may certainly profitably compare Nazrul's poem Bidrohi to Yeats's poetry of decolonization, Amy Césare's anti-colonial poetry, Frantz Fanon's liberationist counter-narrative of anti-imperialist resistance, and the works of other third world writers that Edward Said, for instance, catalogs and values in his work Culture and Imperialism. Jose Marti, Jose Carlos Maria Tegue, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Amilcar Cabral, among others. In fact, in his Culture and Imperialism, Said theorizes the very culture of opposition and resistance at some length and maintains, I quote from Said, "One of the first tasks of the culture of resistance was to reclaim, rename, and re-inhabit the land." And with that came a whole set of further assertions, recoveries, and identifications, all of them quite literally grounded on this poetically projected base, unquote. Bidrohi can certainly be read as a poem of assertions and identifications in the Saidian sense. Nazrul as an act of identification and assertion, foregrounds, accentuates, enacts, repeats, and even renders ubiquitous the I, used more than 100 times in the poem. Also, he does it with such force and fire and fury that one gets the impression that Nazrul keeps exploding his verbal bombs, one after another, at the roots of colonialism. In fact, at all forms and forces of oppression. Thus, Nazrul's Bidrohi seems to be anticipating the spirit of one of the opening statements Frantz Fanon makes in The Wretched of the Earth. I quote from Fanon, "Decolonization is a violent phenomenon," unquote. And in his penchant for decolonization, then Nazrul, in his Bidrohi, resorts to linguistic violence in order to withstand and even completely do away with colonial violence itself, in the very interest of building what Nazrul Islam himself calls a, quote, "a new universe of joy and peace," unquote. But it is unfortunate that while Edward Said, in his Culture and Imperialism, particularly in his chapter called Resistance and Opposition, invokes a number of anti-colonial poets and writers from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, he does not mention our Qazi Nazrul Islam at all. Said even commends Rabindranath's so-called progressive take vis-a-vis nationalism, and rather uncritically places him side by side with the black theorist, writer, activist W.E.B. Du Bois. But Said assigns Nazrul a blank in his otherwise massive undertaking Probably this blank has to do with Said's own lack of familiarity with Nazrul's work in English translation. But one can surely argue that a reading of Nazrul's work could have significantly contributed to the strength of Said's chapter on anti-colonial resistance and opposition. And as a text of resistance and opposition, Bidrohi opens up a space of possibilities by way of first identifying a series of contraries and binary oppositions and then transforming them into an aesthetically and politically strategic unity against colonialism and religious sectarianism, for instance. This strategic unity is particularly signaled and enacted by a movement from the I to the we, a movement that we notice particularly towards the end of the poem. And also Nazrul's style of bringing together different and disparate elements is revealing and instructive. It is then important to notice how Nazrul yokes together certain elements of Hindu mythology and those of Islam. Well, of course, this is no mere textual chutnification for Nazrul. Indeed, the ways in which Nazrul brings together those different and even apparently contradictory elements do not attest to an unproblematically orchestrated unity of Islam and Hinduism as such, but they strategically point to the over-determined tensions and transactions between the two in response to what Franz Fanon calls the perverted logic of colonialism that is characteristically binaristic and divisive. Also, at other levels, Nazrul's language offers a frequent interplay between the poetic and the prosaic, between the lyrical and the dramatic, between the indigenous and the foreign. And one cannot fail to notice how deftly Nazrul combines lexical resources drawn from Arabic and Persian and Bengali in ways in which he inaugurates certain exciting relations of language in Bangla poetry itself. His new relations of language are further characterized by the ways in which he chooses words and even localized idioms from rural Bangladesh, and also uses Sanskritized words on certain registers. At least occasionally, the tone in Bidrohi is grippingly conversational, while his style overall is playfully elusive. Indeed, Nazrul creates a language that is markedly different from that of Rabindranath Tagore on the one hand, and from the language of Bangla literary modernism, represented differently by such poets as Jivanananda Das, Sudhin Datta, Amiya Chakraborty, Buddhadev Bosu, and Vishnu De on the other. Finally, Qazi Nazrul Islam, one of the greatest revolutionary poets in the world, certainly remains alive and relevant as long as his lines continue to resonate with the wretched of the earth, with the oppressed of the world. I quote in translation from Nazrul, "I, the great rebel, shall rest in quiet only when I find the sky and the air free of the groans of the wretched of the earth." Unquote. Indeed, it is in the interest of our anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist, and anti-patriarchal struggles that we need to reread, remobilize, and even reinvent Qazi Nazrul Islam. Thank you.